Spain, the empire that once ruled the world. From the golden coasts of the Americas to the marble courts of Madrid, it stood as the beating heart of Christian Europe. But beneath its splendor, beneath its hymns and crowns, lay a secret rot, a sickness that would fester inside its throne. And in 1784, that sickness took human form. His name was Ferdinand, the boy who would one day be called El Rey Deseado, the desired king, and later, Spain's darkest shadow. He was born into the palace of Madrid, a world of mirrors and masks. The royal tutors called him obedient, cautious, gentle. But the servants whispered something else, that even as a child, Ferdinand's smile never reached his eyes, that he liked to watch people kneel, that he learned early what fear could make men do. Spain in the late 18th century was collapsing under its own weight. The empire that once fed on gold and conquest now choked on corruption and superstition. King Charles IV was weak, more interested in hunting than ruling, and the real power lay in the hands of his ambitious wife, Queen Maria Luisa, and her lover, the manipulative minister Manuel de Godoy. Godoy, handsome, cunning, and hated, became the most powerful man in Spain. He was the queen's favorite, the king's shadow, the people's curse, and in the eyes of young Ferdinand, he was the usurper. The boy prince watched from behind the velvet curtains as his father signed decrees under Godoy's whisper. He saw his mother smile for another man, and something dark began to grow in him, a cold mixture of jealousy, humiliation, and hatred. By the time Ferdinand reached his teenage years, he no longer spoke of love or honor. He spoke only of revenge. Madrid became a labyrinth of conspiracies. Ferdinand gathered allies, courtiers, priests, and nobles who despised Godoy. They called themselves El Partido Fernandino, the party of Ferdinand. By night, they met in secret chambers, speaking of salvation and purity, but their eyes burned with ambition. Every revolution begins with whispers, and in Spain, those whispers carried the promise of blood. In 1807, Ferdinand made his move. He forged letters accusing Godoy and the Queen of treason against the throne. He planned to have them arrested, perhaps even executed. But before he could strike, the plan was discovered. Charles IV, humiliated, ordered his son's arrest. Ferdinand was dragged through the palace he was born in, his hands bound in gold chains. He was the Prince of Spain, kneeling before his father's fury. And yet, he smiled, because as the guards led him away, the people outside the palace were chanting his name. Viva Fernando! Viva el Deseado! The boy who tried to overthrow his parents was becoming a symbol, not of rebellion, but of salvation. Then came the storm from the north. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, looked upon Spain not as an ally, but as prey. He saw the weakness of its kings, the divisions of its court, and the greed of its nobles, and he decided to take it all. In 1808, under the guise of the peace, French troops crossed into Spain. They marched not as invaders, but as guests, until the gates of Madrid opened, and Spain realized it was a prisoner in its own land. The people revolted, the royal family panicked, and in the chaos, Charles IV abdicated the throne in favor of his son. Ferdinand VII, the boy who had lived in shadows, was now king of Spain, but his reign began not with triumph, but with deceit. Napoleon invited Ferdinand to meet him in France as brothers to secure peace. The young king, desperate for legitimacy, accepted. When he arrived, he was greeted with smiles, applause, and betrayal. Within days, Napoleon ordered him imprisoned. The desired king became the emperor's captive, his throne given to Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Spain, the once mighty empire, was now ruled by a foreign king. For 6 long years, Ferdinand lived as a prisoner in France. While his country bled in rebellion, the brutal Guerra de Independencia Española, he sat in comfort, writing letters to his captor. Some say he was broken, others say he was learning. Napoleon studied him closely. The young king's mind fascinated him. He once told his aides, "This one could rule hell itself." In his isolation, Ferdinand began to craft a new persona, no longer the victim, no longer the son or the prisoner, but something colder. He learned how to flatter his enemies, deceive his allies, and survive humiliation with a smile. He studied the politics of fear, how men would betray their faith for a promise, how nations could be broken with the right words. And when the French Empire began to crumble, Ferdinand waited patiently, ready to return not as a savior, but as something much worse. In 1814, Napoleon's armies fell. France retreated, and Spain, scarred, starved, and broken, rose to welcome back its king. As Ferdinand crossed the border, the people knelt before him. Women threw flowers at his feet. Church bells rang for hours. He had become a myth, the king who suffered for his people. The chosen one returned. But the man who came back to Spain was not the same man who left. His smile was gentler, his words more measured, yet his eyes, cold, predatory, and void of empathy, told another story. He entered Madrid beneath golden banners that read, "Viva el Deseado," and the first decree he signed was to destroy the very people who had fought to restore him. The liberal constitution written by the Spanish rebels who resisted Napoleon was torn apart. Its authors, imprisoned, exiled, or executed. Spain's dream of freedom died the moment its savior returned. Ferdinand declared himself the absolute monarch. Every reform, every hope, every whisper of liberty, silenced. He brought back the Inquisition, rearmed the church, and filled the prisons with anyone who dared to think. He turned Spain into a living tomb, where priests blessed the gallows and peasants prayed for the mercy of a king who had none. The people began to whisper again, but this time their words were not of hope. They were of horror. And so, the stage was set. The prince who hated his mother, the prisoner who admired his captor, the savior who betrayed his people, had returned to rule. But the darkness that would follow was far greater than tyranny. It would stain not just his reign, but the very soul of Spain. This was only the beginning. Power does not reveal the soul, it strips it bare. And for Ferdinand VII, power was not salvation. It was the mirror that showed him what he truly was. When Ferdinand returned to his palace, it was no longer the home of kings. It had become a theater, and every man inside was an actor, playing his part under fear of death. Ministers swore loyalty through tears. Nobles kissed his ring and whispered blessings, while secretly praying not to be noticed. The king didn't need armies to control them. He had their terror. He rewarded devotion not with wealth or titles, but with humiliation. He would summon courtiers at midnight, ask them to sing or crawl, just to see how far power could bend the spine of a man. The French philosopher Voltaire once said, "Power corrupts." But in Ferdinand's court, power didn't corrupt, it consumed. Ferdinand's first queen was Maria Antonia, daughter of the King of Naples, a gentlewoman, educated, devout, and full of hope. But she was also everything Ferdinand despised, intelligent, independent, and loved by the people. The marriage was meant to unite two royal houses, but in truth, it became a battlefield. One fought in silence and cruelty. At banquets, Ferdinand would mock her accent, her gestures, her piety. He forbade her from meeting ambassadors, from speaking to servants, from writing to her own family. He placed spies in her chambers and priests in her shadow. Every morning, she would kneel before the chapel altar, praying for deliverance. And every night, the walls would whisper her tears back to her. When she fell ill, Ferdinand refused her physicians. He called it divine punishment. When she died in 1806, some said of sickness, others of poison, the palace bells rang for 3 days. Ferdinand did not attend her funeral. He merely said, God has rid me of another enemy. The court that surrounded him mirrored his soul, a gallery of opportunists, informers, and hypocrites. He filled his ministries with men who had no talent, only obedience. He replaced scholars with priests, generals with flatterers, and thinkers with fanatics. In Spain, intellect became treason. Art, philosophy, even laughter. All were crimes if the king disapproved. But behind the silence, the city of Madrid began to rot. Prostitutes wandered the same streets as priests. Merchants bribed soldiers for safety. The Inquisition returned, burning not witches or heretics this time, but ideas. And at the center of this moral collapse stood Ferdinand, not as ruler, but as ringmaster of a circus of sin. He would sit in his grand salon, surrounded by paintings of saints, and laugh as his courtiers fought to entertain him, with flattery, cruelty, and gossip. He loved secrets more than truth. He collected them like treasures. Every betrayal in Madrid, every scandal, every whisper of lust or power, sooner or later, it reached the king's ears. And when it did, he used it. Among Ferdinand's closest allies was Father Victoriano, a Dominican friar whose sermons were said to shake men's souls. He preached obedience to the king as if it were obedience to God, and in return, Ferdinand granted him absolute power over the confessions of the nobility. It was genius and terrifying. Through the priest's ears, Ferdinand heard every secret sin of his kingdom. Adulteries, betrayals, hidden debts, conspiracies whispered in the dark, all recorded, all weaponized. Nobles who defied him found their sins read aloud in court. Priests who questioned him were accused of heresy. The confessional, once a place of forgiveness, became a spy's den, a sanctified prison. Even the most pious began to wonder if God still listened, or if Ferdinand had taken his place. To survive in Ferdinand's court was to surrender your dignity. Men traded their integrity for appointments, women their virtue for protection. The palace was no longer a home. It was a marketplace of souls. He would host lavish dinners where the wine never stopped flowing, where music played until dawn, and where the boundary between ceremony and corruption vanished. Those who refused to partake, priests, widows, idealists, were labeled as traitors or French sympathizers. They disappeared quietly, and their names were erased from history. Spain had become a kingdom of silence. While the court indulged in its madness, one man watched and painted. Francisco de Goya, the royal painter who had seen too much. In his canvases, Ferdinand appeared neither heroic nor divine, but monstrous, his face swollen with arrogance, his crown gleaming like a shackle. Goya's black paintings, created in secret during this time, were not just art, they were prophecy. The twisted figures, the screams, the silent despair, they were Spain itself, a nation devouring its own reflection. When the series was discovered decades later, one inscription shocked historians: Saturno devorando a su hijo. Saturn devouring his son, a god eating his own child. Was it myth or metaphor? To many, Goya was painting the truth of Ferdinand VII. The war heroes who had fought the French returned expecting glory. Instead, they found chains. Generals who had led the resistance were accused of treason. Writers who had inspired the revolution were hanged in silence. Ferdinand's revenge spared no one. He saw in every hero a rival, in every patriot a threat. He once said to his advisors, "Spain needs one will, and it is mine." And so, one by one, the men who had freed Spain from Napoleon vanished. Their estates confiscated, their families ruined, their names forgotten. Ferdinand called it purification, but the people called it what it truly was, the New Inquisition. The king began to lose sleep. He would walk the halls at night, muttering to himself. He saw betrayal everywhere, in the eyes of servants, in the whispers of the wind. He dismissed his ministers one by one, until only the most sycophantic remained. In those years, Spain stagnated. No art, no progress, no hope. The empire that once spanned the oceans now drowned in its own filth. But Ferdinand didn't see ruin. He saw control. Every silence in his kingdom was proof that his people feared him, and to him, fear was love. They say absolute power reveals the monster within. But in Ferdinand's case, power didn't reveal the monster, it created one. He had become a god among insects, a man who believed the crown was not a burden, but a weapon. And in his warped mind, he began to believe something else, that if he was the chosen of God, then sin itself was holy in his hands. The next chapter of his rule would turn Spain from a kingdom of fear into a temple of corruption. When kings believe they are gods, the line between sin and divinity disappears. By the 1820s, Ferdinand VII ruled not just Spain, he ruled fear itself. And fear was his favorite language. The king who had destroyed the revolution now crowned himself the defender of the faith. He paraded through Madrid, wrapped in golden vestments, flanked by bishops, his crown gleaming beneath the cross. To the church, he was God's sword. To the people, he was the devil in disguise. He reinstated the Inquisition's darkest practices, not in open torture chambers, but in confession, in silence, in fear. Men vanished after Mass. Women who questioned priests were branded as heretics. Children were forced to denounce their fathers. The kingdom became a sanctified prison. Every prayer watched, every soul weighed. And yet, behind the cathedral walls, the king who preached chastity and holiness was descending into a private abyss. Years of excess had turned Ferdinand's body into a battlefield. His health decayed faster than his kingdom. His skin grew pale, his legs swollen, his breath heavy with sickness. Doctors warned him to rest. He accused them of treason. He trusted only those who told him what he wished to hear. Priests who promised that suffering was proof of divine favor. They said his illness was holy, that his pain was the mark of God's chosen. And he believed them. He wore his sickness like a crown. Ferdinand's obsession with control extended beyond politics. He had lost his first wife, Maria Antonia. He married again and again, seeking not companionship, but domination. Each queen was younger, more fearful than the last. Each was chosen not for wisdom, but for submission. The court called them the silent brides. They appeared in public as ornaments, dressed in jewels, their eyes cast down. Some died young, others simply vanished. No one dared to ask questions. To the outside world, the royal marriages were signs of divine providence. Inside the palace, they were chains. Beneath the throne room, in a sealed corridor forgotten by most, there existed what servants whispered of as El Gabinet des Plaisirs, the cabinet of pleasures. It was a room of mirrors, a place where Ferdinand indulged the fantasies he would publicly condemn. Every noble in Madrid knew of its existence, yet none dared to speak of it. There were nights when music drifted from beneath the palace floor, when torches burned until dawn. And in the morning, the king would emerge for Mass, his face pale, his hands trembling, as if he'd seen both heaven and hell. Historians debate what truly occurred in that hidden chamber. Was it merely indulgence, or ritual? Did the king seek escape from his guilt, or communion with something darker? No record survives, only rumors carved in the whispers of servants and the tears of those who were never seen again. In these years, Ferdinand employed a court artist known only as Valdez. Little is known of him. No portraits survive, no signature remains. He was said to have been commissioned to paint private works for the king, pieces that never saw daylight, depictions of divine ecstasy and mortal corruption. When Valdez disappeared in 1827, his studio was burned, but among the ashes, one fragment was found. A charcoal sketch of a crowned man kneeling before a cross, his face twisted between pleasure and agony. On the back, 3 words were scrawled in Latin, Deus incarn. God in flesh. While Ferdinand sank deeper into madness, Spain itself bled. The people starved, fields went untended, the treasury emptied into the pockets of priests and courtiers. To distract them, the king ordered grand religious processions, parades of pain meant to remind the people of divine punishment. Men walked barefoot through the streets, their backs torn open by chains. Women carried crosses taller than themselves, weeping in ecstasy, begging forgiveness for sins they never committed. Ferdinand watched from his palace balcony, his eyes shining with fascination. To him, this was beauty, his people bound to faith, to fear, to him. He once said to his confessor, "They suffer because I do. Their pain proves my divinity." The nobility sent their daughters to the palace, not out of loyalty, but survival. A royal invitation could not be refused, and a royal visit could not be denied. Ferdinand's appetites were whispered across the empire. To some, he was a god. To others, a monster. To most, he was both. The church turned its gaze away, blessing what could not be stopped, for the king was the church's protector and Spain's chosen son of heaven. What happened within those golden walls was never written, only feared. By 1829, Ferdinand's health was failing rapidly. His nights were sleepless, his dreams haunted. He saw the faces of the dead, wives, servants, enemies. Sometimes he spoke to them aloud. He ordered all the mirrors in his palace covered, save for one, the one before his bed. He would sit for hours, staring into his reflection, whispering prayers, then curses, then laughter. He once told his chamberlain, "If God made me in his image, then perhaps he looks like this." And he touched the mirror, leaving a bloody fingerprint on the glass. While the king played God, Spain was dying. The countryside was empty, the army unpaid. The colonies in the Americas, once the jewels of the empire, were gone, freed, or stolen. Spain, the empire of gold and glory, was reduced to ashes and hunger. But Ferdinand did not care. He saw rebellion as sin, poverty as penance, and death as divine will. He would rather rule a graveyard than share his throne. But even fear has limits. Across Spain, whispers began again, not of faith, but of freedom. Writers, soldiers, and scholars, those who survived the purges, met in secret to speak the unspeakable, that the king was mad, that Spain could no longer live under the shadow of his crown. Pamphlets appeared in the night, calling him the Tyrant of God. And for the first time in years, Ferdinand began to lose control. The priests still called him chosen. The nobles still called him king. But behind the cathedral doors and the palace gates, the people began to remember something greater than fear. They began to remember anger. And soon, that anger would find a voice. Empires do not fall in a single night. They die slowly, from within. By the 1830s, Spain had become a hollow echo of itself. Once the empire of gold and faith, it was now a kingdom of starvation, spies, and ghosts. And at its center sat a dying king who still believed he was God. The whispers that Ferdinand thought he had crushed had turned into flames. The liberales, the intellectuals, soldiers, and reformers he had imprisoned, were returning, not with weapons, but with words. They wrote of a new Spain, one built not on the divine right of kings, but on the will of its people. Their ideas spread faster than the king's spies could burn them, and for the first time, the people who once kissed the ground beneath his feet began to question the throne itself. In 1820, a man named Rafael del Riego, a soldier once loyal to the crown, rose in rebellion. His army refused to sail to America to fight for a dead empire. Instead, they turned their weapons toward Madrid. Ferdinand was caught off guard. His soldiers joined the uprising. His ministers fled. The tyrant who had ruled with absolute power was suddenly a prisoner once more, this time of his own people. He was forced to swear allegiance to a new constitution. The the same liberal charter he had destroyed a decade before. For 3 brief years, Spain tasted freedom again. But it would not last. In the palaces of Europe, Ferdinand's fall was seen not as justice, but as contagion. Kings feared that revolution would spread like fire, and so they conspired to extinguish it. Under the Holy Alliance, France sent an army, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, to restore order in Spain. In 1823, they crossed the Pyrenees, crushing the liberals town by town, until the tricolor banners of freedom were torn down and replaced once more with the crimson standard of the crown. And when the French reached Madrid, Ferdinand returned to his throne with a smile that chilled the world. He called it a divine miracle. He thanked God for restoring his servant. But what returned was not a king. It was a ghost wearing a crown. Ferdinand had seen rebellion and mercy. Now he would offer neither. He unleashed a new reign of terror. Every liberal was hunted. Every soldier who had raised a banner for freedom was executed without trial. The prisons overflowed again. The gallows became sacred altars. He declared, "Spain will kneel once more, and I will teach her how to pray." Even the church, which had blessed his every cruelty, began to fracture. Some priests, horrified by the bloodshed, refused to read his decrees from the pulpit. Others were silenced or disappeared. In the monasteries, secret letters began to circulate, warnings that the king had become possessed by his own blasphemy. A Jesuit scholar wrote, "He believes he is divine, but he has forgotten that even God can die." While Ferdinand played God at home, Spain's empire abroad disintegrated. Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, the colonies rebelled and won their independence. One by one, the territories that had fed Spain's wealth for centuries broke their chains. The treasure fleets stopped coming, the ports emptied, and the once mighty empire was reduced to a pauper's kingdom. Spain had traded its gold for obedience, and now had neither. In his final years, Ferdinand married for the 4th time, Maria Cristina, a woman much younger than he, chosen not for love, but for legacy. She bore him 2 daughters, one of whom, Isabella, would one day inherit the throne. The birth of a girl should have been joy, but to Ferdinand, it was an omen. He feared the end of his line. He feared the return of the liberals. He feared death. And so he did what he had always done. He sought control. Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos, claimed that no woman could rule Spain, that the crown belonged to him. Half the court sided with Carlos, half with the king's infant daughter. It was not just a family feud, it was the spark of a civil war. To secure his daughter's throne, Ferdinand signed the Pragmatic Sanction, a decree allowing women to inherit the crown. It was his last act of defiance, not against tyranny, but against his own bloodline. By 1833, the king was a dying ruin. His once booming voice had turned into a whisper. His eyes wandered between madness and terror. He spent his final days surrounded by priests, begging God for forgiveness and ordering the execution of anyone who questioned him. It is said that on his final night, he demanded the royal crown be placed upon his head as he lay dying. He whispered, "Spain is mine, even in death." When dawn came, the crown had slipped from his skull. Ferdinand VII, the man who had called himself God, died in the early hours of September 29th, 1833. He left behind a kingdom divided, a dynasty cursed, and a people too broken to mourn. Outside the palace, as the bells rang, a voice cried out in the crowd, "May he rot with the kings he killed." The guards silenced it quickly, but history would not forget. They buried him with all the honors of a monarch, the golden crown, the crimson robes, the silver crucifix. But the people of Spain buried more than a man that day. They buried the last illusion of divine kingship. For centuries, Spain had worshipped its rulers as chosen by God. Ferdinand's reign proved that even God's chosen could become demons. The empire was gone, the faith was fractured, And Spain, once feared by the world, now stood alone among the ruins of its own obedience. And when kings die, their crowns are buried with them, but their sins live on. Ferdinand VII was gone, but his shadow remained. It lingered over Spain, a country divided, bleeding, and haunted by the ghost of its most perverted king. When the news of Ferdinand's death reached the streets, there were no tears, no mourning crowds, only whispers. He had left behind no sons, only a fragile baby girl, Isabella, and a brother who thirsted for power. Don Carlos, the self-proclaimed heir, declared that Spain could not be ruled by a woman. He raised an army, calling his cause divine, for faith, for king, for God. But it was not faith that drove him. It was vengeance. And so began one of the bloodiest civil wars in Spanish history, the First Carlist War. Spain tore itself apart. Brother fought brother. Villages burned in the name of kings who were already dust. Priests marched with soldiers, holding crucifixes in one hand and muskets in the other. They said the war was for God, but the fields of Navarre and Aragon became graveyards of faith. Tens of thousands died, and still neither side could claim victory. The curse of Ferdinand had taken hold, a nation addicted to obedience, unable to live without a master, even if the master was madness itself. The child queen, Isabella II, was crowned before she could walk. Behind her throne stood her mother, Maria Cristina, and behind her, the same circle of priests and courtiers that had once served Ferdinand. Spain had not escaped tyranny. It had merely changed its face. The royal court once again filled with corruption, debauchery, and whispers. The ministers drank, the generals plotted, and the people starved. The new queen became a puppet, a living reminder that the blood of Ferdinand still ruled. The church, weakened by revolution, saw its chance to rise again. It declared that Ferdinand's reign had been a test from God, a punishment for Spain's sins, a trial of faith. But it was not repentance they preached, it was obedience. And once more, the people knelt. Confession replaced protest. Fear replaced freedom. The shadow of the Inquisition crept back through the land, not as fire and torture, but as silence. Spain was learning the hardest lesson of all. You can kill a tyrant, but not the faith that created him. For decades, the city would whisper his name. Servants swore that the royal corridors were haunted, that on stormy nights they could hear Ferdinand's cough echoing through the halls. Others claimed to have seen him, a pale figure dressed in royal white, walking from mirror to mirror, searching for his reflection. One guard even confessed to seeing the king's shadow kneeling before the throne, as if still ruling from beyond the grave. The palace chaplain refused to stay overnight. He said, "The devil does not need a body when he has a crown." Ferdinand was buried among Spain's greatest monarchs, Philip II, Charles V, the builders of empire. But when historians opened the vault decades later, they found something strange. Unlike the others, Ferdinand's coffin was unmarked. No inscription, no prayer, no blessing. A silent box among kings who had their names carved into eternity. It was as if Spain itself had tried to erase him. But history never forgets. The archives, the letters, the confessions, all reveal the same truth, that Ferdinand VII destroyed his country not through conquest, but through corruption. Across Europe, his story became a warning. In France, in Austria, in Russia, whenever a monarch demanded blind faith, whispered voices would say, "Remember Spain. Remember the king who became a god. Remember the god who became a monster." Ferdinand's legacy outlived him, not as a memory, but as a disease. It infected every palace that believed obedience was peace, every crown that believed fear was power. They called it El Mal de Reyes, the king's disease, a curse said to fall upon every ruler who placed himself above his people. Those who believed themselves divine would rot while still alive, their kingdoms collapsing as offerings to their pride. Ferdinand was its purest form, a man who desired love, but knew only submission, who demanded worship but gave only fear, who called his cruelty faith and his lust divine. And Spain. Spain became the altar upon which he sacrificed his soul. In death, the myths say, Ferdinand faced judgment not from God, but from the ghosts of those he had ruled, the peasants he starved, the lovers he destroyed, the priests he silenced, the artists he censored, and when he begged for mercy, a voice, perhaps his own, whispered back, "You wanted to be a god, now bear eternity as one. Condemn not to hell, but to memory, because for tyrants, the cruelest punishment is to be remembered as they truly were." By the late 1800s, a new Spain began to rise. Writers, poets, and revolutionaries invoked Ferdinand's name not in reverence, but in warning. They built a republic of words before it became one of laws. They dreamed of a country free from crowns and confession. And though it would take a century and more, Spain would finally begin to shed the chains of divine tyranny. Ferdinand VII wanted immortality, and he got it. But not the way he dreamed. His name endures, not as a hero, but as a reminder that even the mightiest throne can become a tomb. History remembers him as El Rey Deseado, the desired king. But desire turned to disgust, and his crown became a curse. So, when you walk the halls of Madrid and hear the faint echo of footsteps in the dark, remember this. It is not the ghost of a king that haunts Spain. It is the memory of power and the silence that allowed it to reign.